Over the past few decades, the helicopter aeromedical industry has proven itself to be a very effective means of saving the lives of those who are critically ill or injured. However, during the relatively short life of our industry, far too many aeromedical programs, its crews, and sometimes its patients have fallen to tragic accidents. And the highest percentage of these crashes have been caused by human error. Now, often this fact leads us to ask the question, what was the pilot thinking? Why did he act the way he did? And what's even more confusing is why are the same mistakes still being made over and over again throughout our industry? As you go through this training and watch the scenarios, we suggest that you heavily concentrate on the error chain depicted in each scenario and how these steps ultimately lead to a crash. Ask yourself, what were the contributing factors? Were there opportunities to break this chain? Was there a specific culture in a program that affected the pilot's decision-making? And finally, were there direct and/or indirect pressures that influenced the pilot's decision? And finally, before we begin with the scenarios, there are two major points to note. First, none of these scenarios are contrived. Each contain multiple contributing factors and influences taken directly from industry accident and incident reports, as well as confidential surveys recently completed by your peers concerning practices and safety problems within our industry. And second, this video would not be possible if it were not for the support of aeromedical helicopter operators, hospital programs, and their crews, as well as all of the other supporting agencies named in the closing credits of this video. These companies donated their equipment, personnel, and the display of their logos to demonstrate unsafe safety practices in the sincere hope that taking a proactive approach through this training will help to significantly improve the safety record of this worthwhile industry. Now let's begin with the first scenario. The day begins with Anne, an experienced flight nurse, in her home about to leave for a day shift. As she leaves, she promises her daughter that she will be home that evening to see her dance in a recital. The morning also starts with Skip, the day shift duty pilot, on the phone with his ex-wife. He is promising her that he will be there at 8 p.m. sharp to pick up the kids for their planned week-long camping trip. Skip's ex-wife reminds him that she too has an obligation that evening and would not appreciate him being late. The shift begins with Skip checking weather, which in the morning is VFR with haze, but is forecasted to diminish to IFR conditions by the end of the shift. This is a VFR program based at an airport. Following his weather check, Skip pre-flights the aircraft, while Anne checks all of the medical supplies and equipment on the aircraft along with Paul, a new flight medic who has just completed training during the past 2 weeks. Following the pre-flight activities, Skip, Anne, and Paul join a program staff meeting where the prior month's activity was reviewed. Flights are down, another flight program in the local area is turning up their marketing efforts, and the hospital administration is getting concerned. The day progresses with no flight requests. Skip keeps himself busy reading magazines while Anne and Paul inspect and clean their equipment. The weather has started to deteriorate, and the new forecast continues to support IFR conditions before the end of the shift. By mid-afternoon, the weather has lowered, with rain showers and mist also added to the amended forecast. Skip feels comfortable to call his ex-wife at 4 p.m. to tell her that the weather has lowered to the point that he doesn't expect to fly and sees no problem with him being on time for the kids. Shortly after that call, a flight request comes in for the transfer of the patient from the requesting hospital to a third hospital. Skip checks the weather, and all points are still reporting basic VFR conditions, even though the forecast is for IFR. Skip is a locally familiar pilot who has flown this route many times before, and although the weather has diminished throughout the day, it's still above the minimums for their operation specifications. He's also concerned about their low flight activity and decides that he can fly the trip and be back in time to beat the IFR weather and pick up his kids on time. Anne questions his decision because of the weather and her concern for getting back to make her daughter's recital. Skip assures her he would not accept the flight if he didn't think he could make it all the way home. Paul, the new crew member, offers no opinion on the decision to fly. The helicopter departs the airport for the requesting hospital. The weather during the first leg is as stated in the weather briefing, and they arrive at the referring hospital without difficulty. The patient is loaded into the helicopter and they depart for the receiving hospital. During this leg, the weather has obviously started to deteriorate due to ceilings, haze, and mist. This causes Skip to have increasing concern as to whether the conditions he's observing will worsen before they get home. In addition to attending to her patient, Anne is also becoming concerned about the weather and its possible effect on getting home. The helicopter arrives at the receiving hospital and the patient is unloaded. While the medical crew is delivering the patient to the appropriate location, Skip receives a telephone weather briefing which reveals marginal VFR to spotty IFR conditions in the area and below Skip's personal comfort level. When the crew returns, he briefs them on the current conditions, his concerns, and suggests calling the hospital van to come and get them and leaving the helicopter overnight. Anne immediately becomes very upset and ridicules Skip for his decision to take the flight in the first place, especially when she questioned the weather from the start and reminds him of her promise to her daughter. She argues that if the weather is at legal operations minimums, and he has flown that route many times before, he should at least try it before he gives up. His thoughts also briefly go to the grief he will receive from his ex-wife for being late to get the kids. He looks to Paul for his thoughts, and he simply says he's willing to go along with whatever the other two decide. Rather than continue the argument, Skip agrees to try it, and they depart for the base. This hospital-based program has been in continuous service for 15 years and using the same vendor for the past 10 years. Even though both the hospital and the vendor were well respected in their service area for professionalism and response time, the hospital was on a new campaign to bolster its image, and the vendor was doing the same in preparation for contract renewal negotiations about to begin. One area of major concern to the hospital was the drop in the number of scene requests the program received. Recent staff meetings had focused on this concern and ways to improve the scene call numbers. Numerous in-service training and PR flights have been conducted to bolster the use of air care for scene calls, as well as provide additional training for first responders. And it worked. On a beautiful VFR day, the dispatch center received a call from a nearby county for air care to respond to a single-car accident involving a mother and her son. The duty pilot was an experienced aeromedical pilot, but relatively new to this program, and was delighted that a flight request for a scene run had finally come in. Upon departure, the pilot entered the coordinates that the first responder unit called into the air care dispatch. What the dispatch center and the pilot did not know is that the first responder called in incorrect coordinates, which would send the helicopter to a point in the county 15 miles away from the actual scene. When the pilot arrived at the point given, there was no sign of any accident or landing zone. Still new to the area, descriptions of highway numbers and intersections at the actual scene did not help. However, the medical crew was familiar with some of the landmarks they were over, and the pilot relayed this information to the local first responder. Additionally, the first responder's explanation of where they were allowed the air care dispatcher to look up the location on their county grid maps and plot their own lat-longs to give to the pilot. The error was finally cleared up, and the helicopter proceeded to the actual scene location with an ETA of about 12 minutes later than planned. Because the mother was already removed from the vehicle and the helicopter had not arrived, EMS elected to send her by ambulance to a local hospital for initial evaluation. The landing zone was a field next to the road, and EMS and fire crews blocked the road from all traffic for the helicopter. The pilot landed the helicopter so as to position the loading side toward the accident, which also kept the tail rotor out of the direct path of the cruise. However, this put the tail into the wind. Since rescue crews were still working on extricating the child from the vehicle, the pilot elected to shut down the helicopter during the wait. Approximately 5 minutes later, the child was freed from the vehicle and loaded into the helicopter. It was obvious to the pilot that this child was in very bad condition and needed to get to the trauma center as quickly as possible. Once the area was clear of ground personnel, the pilot started the helicopter's #1 engine. During the process, a hot start occurred. The pilot glanced back at the medical crew to see them frantically working on this critically injured child. They had no clue that the hot start even occurred or that a problem might exist. The pilot tried the second engine, which started normally, followed by an acceptable restart of the first engine. He still had no idea if any damage had occurred and considered aborting the mission. However, with a blocked roadway, a critically injured child, and engines that seemed to be running fine, the pilot ultimately elected to depart for the trauma center. Tim is an experienced aeromedical pilot. His VFR program works him on a 7-on, 7-off schedule, alternating each tour with days or nights. He was currently on his 6th night of a 7-night tour. This was a particularly long week with no flying due to lack of requests or marginal weather forcing the flights to be turned down. This didn't bother Tim too much since he wasn't in the flying mood. However, the lack of activity was taking its toll on the medical crew. By this point in the tour of nights, they were bored, restless, and tired of having to do make-work projects. In spite of the inactivity, Tim still didn't get much sleep during his nights on duty. He was concerned about his financial situation, which was strained due to a new home he and his wife were having constructed. In an attempt to alleviate some of his money concerns, he was working a second job during his off weeks and when he was on nights. Most of the work was for a friend of his who owned a fly fishing retail store. Tim was making good use of his outdoor skills and knowledge in retail sales by performing many functions at the store. He had worked there on this day up until it was time to leave to report for his duty shift at the hospital. The call came in at dusk for an inter-hospital transfer back to Tim's program base. The weather check revealed that the conditions were, at best, marginal VFR, with scattered rain showers and thunderstorms in the forecast. The weather was legal, but questionable. Additionally, the weather information at the location of the referring hospital was minimal. The doctor at the referring hospital was becoming concerned as to why it was taking so long for the helicopter service to decide whether they would be coming for the patient. He was a privately rated pilot and decided that the conditions were acceptable and phoned the helicopter pilot directly to advise him of this, and that this patient was in serious need of services they could not provide. Tim briefed the medical crew, and they suggested just having a look and turning back if it wasn't good. Tim decided to give it a try, and the helicopter and crew departed for the referring hospital. The weather didn't change, but it was not good. The workload was high, and Tim was continuously deviating around the rain showers. Upon arrival at the referring hospital, the weather was a little worse, but he found the hospital pad and landed without incident. While the medical crew was packaging the patient, Tim became increasingly concerned about the weather. When the medical crew came out with the patient, it was obvious to Tim that they were going to have their hands full. The referring hospital had waited until the very last minute before they called for more advanced help. Additionally, Tim realized that the patient was a very close friend of his. They loaded the patient, and Tim started the helicopter and departed. The workload remained high, and more deviations were required. The medical crew were oblivious to the conditions. Their hands were too full with the patient, whose condition was worsening. Now Tim has a new concern: fuel. All the deviating has taken its share of his normal fuel, and he is unsure of his ability to safely make it back to his hospital without seriously compromising his fuel reserves, and there were no airports along the way to obtain fuel. Uncomfortable with the fact that he might land back at his hospital with only 10 to 15 minutes of fuel remaining, he is considering diverting to a nearby community hospital with a helipad. This would require the patient to have to complete the trip by ground. However, He was also concerned about the criticality of this patient and the urgent need to get to his hospital. Tim elected to continue on to the medical center. Bobby is a pilot who was recently assigned to a contract that was nearly 20 years old. From the very start, Ken, the long-tenured lead pilot at the base, took on the role as mentor to Bobby. At first, Bobby was happy with this because the feedback from the vendor on Ken was very good. It was also immediately obvious to Bobby that Ken appeared to be the favored pilot of the medical crew. It was also obvious to Bobby that things were done differently at this base compared to his prior assignment. For example, pilots were required to complete a computer form every time they turned down a flight for weather, stating the exact reason and include a copy of the computer-generated weather reports with the form. Ken made a practice of closely reviewing all of the turned-down flight summaries in the computer with the other pilots and sometimes questioned the no-go decisions. He also noticed that the hospital administration required the dispatch center to keep exacting records on each flight, when the call came in, and how long it took for the pilot to start and take off from the time the flight request came in. Additionally, the medical crews were almost all longtime team members and exhibited signs of impatience during Bobby's aircraft starting and pre-takeoff procedures. But what bothered Bobby the most was that during his first month at the base, some of his observations of Ken's actions on shift change were not consistent with the company's safety practices. Ken's pre-flight was minimal. He never observed him draining the sumps, closely inspecting the aircraft, or reviewing the maintenance status reports on the helicopter. He never requested any pass-down information on shift change. Getting into the cockpit after Ken, Bobby would notice that the checklist was almost always misplaced, and switches would often be in the incorrect position versus where they should be after shutdown. Recently, one of the newer medical crew members, Dave, who felt comfortable talking to Bobby, expressed that he was uneasy at times when flying with Ken. He explained that Ken seemed to accept flights under worse weather conditions than the other pilots would accept. Also, Ken often likes to fly much lower than the other pilots and seems to not mind going into much more hazardous landing zones for scene work. Finally, there was the time a couple of weeks ago when Ken took another med crew member for a low-level military-style ride in the company's Spare while returning from the maintenance base. This crew member bragged how he got to sit up front while Ken flew low over a field, crow-hopped over trees, flew down a road at treetop level, and did extremely steep bank turns. Dave added that he wanted no part of this type of activity, but was afraid to say anything because he was so new to the program, and that the crew member, named John, enjoyed it so much. Not long after this conversation, a flight request came in for a 3-point transfer. And during the deadhead leg home back to the base after the patient was dropped, John tells Bobby that he should do a low-level run to initiate Dave, which hadn't been done yet, and give him a thrill, just like Ken does for all of the new med crew members. Bobby, trying to act like a part of the team he just joined, dropped down lower, but still within company and FAA guidelines. Although Dave had indicated that this was low enough for him, John pushed the issue and challenged Bobby to be as good of a pilot as his boss Ken.